Hello everyone, I'm Don and welcome to my kitchen. I got another great recipe for you, and this is the ideal Christmas cookie. It was one of my favorite as a kid, and it still is today. It's a recipe from my grandmother Francie, who's no longer with us. It was a handwritten recipe that I was lucky to come into amongst others that I've already made some videos on, such as the Slovenian Petitza and her chocolate chip cookies. Very well received videos, and I'm hoping this one is as well. So we're going to get started right off the bat with the dough. And what I've got here is 1 cup of heavy cream or heavy whipping cream. I have added 1/4 cup of water to that. And then I put it in the microwave for about 50 seconds, which gets it to about 110 degrees. So you could do it in a saucepan, however you'd like, but you don't want to bring it to a boil. You just want to warm it up like tap water, essentially. So I'm going to go ahead and add that to my bowl. And then I'm going to add a teaspoon and a half of regular table sugar. And then we're going to add our yeast. So what we're going to do is activate our yeast. And I've got 4½ teaspoons of active dry yeast, or you can use 2 packets of that from the store. I'm going to go ahead and add that into my milk water mixture with the sugar. And I'm just going to go ahead and give it a stir. We want that yeast to dissolve. So in about 5 minutes, we should get a frothy head on this, and you've probably seen it in other videos and mine as well. So that's called proofing the yeast. That's to show you that the yeast is active. I'm going to go ahead and start with one of our fillings because we want to chill this overnight as well. And this is the apricot filling. And I make a homemade apricot jam. You can actually just go ahead and buy a jar of apricot preserves in the store and use that as well. But what I'm going to start with is 1 pound of dried apricots. And I get these online, and they're quite plump and juicy compared to some of the ones I've seen that are very dry. So I'm going to add those to the saucepan. You want to just cover it to the top with water. I'm going to go ahead and put the burner on, like a medium high. We're going to keep an eye on those because we want to bring it to a boil, then take it down to a simmer, and then we're going to go ahead and add some sugar in. So I'm going to go ahead and move on with the dough while our yeast is proofing. I've got 600 grams of all-purpose flour. What I'm going to do is go ahead and add 1½ teaspoons of baking powder, 1½ teaspoons of salt, table salt, and we're just going to go ahead and give that a mix. And we're going to set that aside. So we're going to go ahead and let the yeast bloom. We're going to let this come to simmer, and when I come back, we'll go ahead and finish making the dough, and we'll walk through the process of finishing up the apricot jam. So I'll be right back. The apricots are boiling. Brought it down to a simmer. It's been about 5 minutes now, and they're starting to get nice and soft, and that's what we're trying to do here. But we're going to go ahead and add 1 cup of granulated sugar. I'm going to add a little bit and stir it in. And put the rest in at this point. Now what we're going to do now is we're going to return it to a simmer and let it go for about 15 minutes. All right, we got about 5 more minutes on these apricots, but we're going to go ahead and move on with our dough. So if you remember, we have 600 grams of all-purpose flour, 1.5 teaspoons of baking powder, 1.5 teaspoons of salt in here. I mixed it up. What I've got here is 2 sticks of cold butter, so unsalted butter. I've diced it into little 1/2-inch pieces, and we're going to go ahead and add that in to our flour. So that's a 1/2 pound of butter. And then you're going to need a pastry blender like this. You could probably do this in a food processor, but I've never done it that way. So what we're going to do is cut the butter in just like you would if it was like a pie crust. So I'm going to just start chopping that butter up and mixing it with the flour. And we want to end up with pieces that are about the size of a pea or smaller. All right, so I got this about where I want it. And I can reach in and I can feel little pieces of butter throughout the flour. And that's what we want, little pieces. So in the meantime, our yeast has bloomed. You can see it's got a frothy head on it. It was in our heavy cream and sugar with a little water added. Now I got 3 whole egg yolks, and we're going to save the whites. And if you've seen my recipe for nut roll or patizza, this is going to be used tomorrow when we make the nut filling, because it's the exact same filling as the nut filling that goes into nut roll. So I'm just going to give these a little scramble and add them into our yeast mixture. And I'm going to give it a little stir. And that was the timer on my stove, which I set for this. So what we're going to do here is, these have reached the point where we've got a very thin syrupy sauce. It's from the sugar, and then we've really softened these up, but we got to cool them down before we do anything else with them. So I'm going to go ahead and shut the burner off. So I'm going to start to add our flour with our butter mix into our yeast mixture. I'm going to add about a cup and a half. This is a Danish dough whisk that I've used on other recipes you might have seen. I like it for this type of dough. And then ultimately we're going to get in there with our hands. So I like to add a little at a time so we can get the ingredients wet. Go ahead and add in another cup and a half. I've added the rest of my flour and butter in, and I'm going to actually start to just do this with my hands because that's how I'm going to finish it anyways. And we're going to do everything right in this bowl. Well, if you have a bowl that has a lid on it, that's ideal because, as I mentioned before, this is going to go into the refrigerator overnight. So I'm getting all my dry ingredients incorporated into this dough ball, and we can actually bring this out on the counter. I'll get a little flour. So what we're going to do is a little hand kneading now. We're going to also hand knead this in the morning. And this is just getting all that butter, all that flour mixed in. You don't have to overdo it. Like I say, we'll knead it again tomorrow morning, but we just want a nice cohesive dough ball. All right, so back in the bowl, I'm going to cover it with some plastic wrap. I'm going to stick it in the fridge overnight. When I come back, we'll move on with the apricot jam. All right, I cleaned up a little bit. Our apricots are still very hot, but I'm going to go ahead and move on with it because we're going to end up refrigerating these overnight as well. I failed to mention also those egg whites. Those 3 egg whites went in the fridge with the cover on them as well with the dough, which we'll be using for that nut mixture. So our apricots are nice and tender now, and there's a syrupy sugar sauce around it. We got to puree them. In the past, I've used a food processor, but ever since I got this little immersion blender, it works quite well. So I'm going to go ahead and use it for this. And you want to be careful because in this case, they're still hot. All right, so this is the kind of consistency we're looking for. And as it cools, it's going to end up being very much like a preserve in a jar. I have to tell you, I've done it both ways. There is a difference. It's a big difference making your jam from scratch and then buying the store-bought version of it. So this is going to go into a container, or perhaps just put a lid on this pot and stick it right in the fridge. If you wanted to do this the same day you're making them, you can do that, but you're going to want to cool that down before you use it on the dough. So when I come back tomorrow, we're going to get that dough out. I'm going to divide it up and portion it out into equal size balls, 10 of them. The recipe will get us 80 cookies. The amount of apricot jam I just made will make 80 cookies. I want to bake both nut and apricot. So I'm going to double my dough recipe. So I'm going to end up with 160 cookies total, which will be half apricot, half nut. Good morning. Welcome to day 2 of Slovenian Kifle, which are apricot and nut horns. And we're going to get started right away with our nut filling. But first of all, I'll tell you what I did this morning. I took out my egg whites, and I think yesterday I said we reserved 3 of the egg whites, but it's actually 2 of the egg whites. And then as well, I took out my apricot filling and my dough. I also kneaded my dough and divided it up into 10 equal portions. As I mentioned yesterday, we're going to get 80 cookies out of this, and so 10 balls, 8 cookies each. They're back in the fridge. You want to keep your dough cold. So getting started with the nut filling, I've got 6 tablespoons of unsalted butter and 1/4 cup of whole milk. And I'm going to stick this in the microwave. We're going to melt it down. And it could take anywhere from 30 seconds or more, depending on how cold your butter is, if it's just refrigerated or it is frozen. So I'm going to go ahead and get this going. So I'm going to take my 2 egg whites, I'm going to add them to my stand mixture. And once again, I took these out this morning because you want them to be room temperature. So I'm going to add my 2 egg whites. And you're going to have your whisk attachment. And we're going to start out and beat. We're going to beat these on high. And it's going to start to get frothy, and we're going to start adding in our vanilla and our sugar. I'm going to go ahead and add in my vanilla. Start to gradually add in my sugar. I've got 2/3 of a cup of sugar here, so I'm going to add a little bit at a time. And that's the rest of my sugar. Now we're going to let that whip on high until it gets to be like a creamy, almost like soft peaks. You don't want to whip it into a meringue. I'm going to go ahead and get my butter out of the microwave. I'm going to give this a little stir. Still a little chunk of butter in there, but I'm going to melt that down. Let that sit. We're going to go ahead and add 1/3 of a cup of granulated sugar to our nuts. Now earlier this morning we got 12 ounces of nuts, and I went ahead and put in my food processor and ground down. And as I mentioned yesterday, this recipe is the exact same ingredients as the filling for my nut roll, and I'll leave a link to that recipe as well, because you're going to love this nut filling. Besides the sugar, 1/3 cup, I'm going to add 3/4 teaspoons of ground cinnamon. I'm going to go ahead and whisk that into my nuts. And you can grind your nuts to whatever consistency you might like. I like to take it down to little pieces, but not a complete powder, because you can really take these down to just being almost a powder. go ahead and add my milk and butter mixture. I'm going to go ahead and whisk that in. And you want to get all the nuts and that cinnamon and sugar so it's all nice and wet from the butter and milk mix. And we're going to stop here and check our eggs. And they look good. So once again, you're not going to bring this to a consistency of a meringue, which is kind of a stiff peaks. You're going to bring it to just a creamy consistency, but it's a nice thick consistency. And I'm going to grab a little spatula, and we're going to go ahead and add that directly into the rest of our nuts, our nut mixture. I'm going to get rid of my whisk and use my spatula to fold that in. To our nut mixture. I don't like to stir at it like I don't like to go at it too hard stirring. Want to keep some of that air in there that we've developed in our egg, and we're good there. So we are just going to set this aside, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to clean up a little bit. I'm going to set up for our cookie making, and I'll be right back. I told you earlier this morning I took my dough out and I kneaded it, and I had portioned it out into 10 equal sized balls, which will give us 80 cookies. I'm not going to do all 80 cookies here for this video, but I am going to go ahead and do, say, 24 cookies, which will be 3 balls, and I'll do a mixture of the nut and the apricot, but you'll get the idea for sure. Once again, these have been in the refrigerator, so we're going to do 1 ball at a time, and I'm going to go ahead and take one out, and then we're going to go ahead and put these back in the fridge, and then I'll just get them out as I need them. But I do want to cover them up so that we don't get dried out. Some of the equipment that we're going to use here today is I have this nice mat which has dimensions on it, which is very nice because we want to roll this out to about 12-inch diameter. And so I like using these mats. With a lot of dough recipes, you want to flour your mat or you want to flour your surface. In this case, we're going to use a mixture of powdered sugar and regular sugar as our dusting mix. So I took this morning I took a half a cup of powdered sugar, a half a cup of regular sugar, put it in a container, and then I basically just give it a good shake. And this is going to be what we put down on our mat, and we're also going to dust our cookies with it before we bake them. In the meantime, I got my oven preheated at 350 degrees. I got a large cookie sheet set up with lined with parchment paper. So I'm going to go ahead and put some of this dusting powder down. Once again, this is a very sticky dough because of the butter content in it, so we don't want it sticking to the mat. And I'm just going to take my hand and press it as far down as first. I'm going to press it into a small circle. Then the rolling pin I have, and you've probably seen these. If you don't have one, you don't need it, but it has these little guide rings which allow you to get to a certain thickness. In this case, we're going to the very smallest thickness, which is 1/16 of an inch. So I'm going to just start to roll If it sticks, you might want to do your rolling pin as well with a little of this. And I'm going to start to go out in both directions because we want to end up with a circle like a pie crust. And you can always take a little of the sugar and dust the top of your dough. All right, so now you're going to either need a pizza cutter, or I have one of these little pastry cutters that I use, and it gives you nice decorative edges. I also use this for ravioli. In fact, I think it came with a ravioli set, but I use it for this because it does a nice decorative edge on these. So you're going to cut this like a pizza. So you want to cut it up the middle, and you want to cut it in half. And then you want to cut each of those in half, so you end up with 8 pieces that are pie shaped. So then you're going to take some of your filling, and in this case I'm going to start with the apricot. You're probably going to use about a teaspoon of filling, and you want to put it on the wide edge. You want to get it up over, and you want to start to roll it up till you have a nice little, and then I give it a little turn, and I try to put that point down so it doesn't jump up on me when it's baking, and they can. So I felt like that was a little bit heavy on the filling on that one, so I'm going to cut back on this one. I do like them filled. And like I said, the dough seems very thin at this point, but when you see how they bake, you'll be surprised. So let's do a couple with the nut filling. So I'm going to go ahead and continue on and make my 24 that I told you we were going to make. That's 3 dough balls worth, a mix of apricot and nut. We'll go ahead and get those in the oven, and you'll see the finished product when we're done. Okay, our Kifle are fresh out of the oven, 15 minutes at 350 degrees. You want to bake them just till you start seeing some golden brown on the edges. I assure you they are thoroughly cooked. You could see obviously the ones that I overfilled. These were my first couple, and my nut filling is just spilling out the end. That has a lot to do with the egg and the nut mixture. It just wants to expand. But I promise you, when I clean these up, they'll look fantastic. So I'm going to let them cool down for about 15 minutes. We'll go ahead and get them plated up, and we'll dust them with some sugar, and they'll be ready to eat. All right, so we got these guys all plated up. Last thing you want to do before you serve them is to give them a little dusting with this powdered sugar mix. So you just kind of sift it on, and they're ready to go. So I only made 24 cookies here today for the video, but I'm going to make 80, actually 160 total. Both those filling recipes are for a total of 80 each, so 160 cookies. If you want to make all nut, you're going to just make the nut. If you want to make all apricot, you make just the apricot in one batch of dough. Otherwise, 2 batches of dough to get the full amount. I want to say, because my daughter loves to make those cookies, and we're going to get together here. A few weeks is Christmas, so I'm going to keep the dough refrigerated for a few days and get her over here, and we're going to go ahead and make them. Me, I got to head out today. My girlfriend wants to make Italian bocconotti cookies, which is another cookie that I make. It's a great Christmas cookie, and we're going to make those today, so I look forward to that. And maybe I'll make a video on those as well. They're a little Italian jam-filled cookies, if you don't know. So that's it for my grandma's Slovenian Kifle, otherwise known as apricot nut horns. One of my favorite Christmas cookies. If you like this kind of video, please like and subscribe to my channel. It would mean a lot to me. please leave comments if you decide to make this recipe and what you think of it. I've been told by many people it's the best pastry dough they've ever tasted. So that excites me. It excites me to bake for people. To me, it's a corny saying, but the number one ingredient in all these baked goods is love. So that's it today. We'll see you again.